Welcome to CNNTalk. We're talking about the Middle East. The professor's back.
Hi.
You've been travelling.
I've been travelling.
I'm a professor too, you know.
Are you?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Visiting professor.
I'm also
at the
visiting
University of East
How are you?
Anglia.
I am not a professor.
Nor me.
You should be. You look like one.
You
I
can
could
pass
be.
for one.
I feel like I could be.
These are important questions we're asking today, not about the Middle East. Middle East moves, will they work? I mean, huge topic, obviously, but we're talking about two separate things here. The Palestinian sort of economic deal that Kushner's presenting, but also these sanctions on Iran that Trump has instigated.
I mean, I think what they have in common is a tenuous grasp of reality. I mean, there seems to be a kind of general theme here that there doesn't feel like there is a strategic approach to Middle East policy that is rooted in the facts on the ground, that is designed to cause a predictable outcome. You could almost say that unpredictability has become the only predictable factor here. And, you look at Kushner's plan that's being discussed in Bahrain, everybody who knows anything about the region says that this is something that sounds really nice, were the facts completely different from
Or
what they
it took
are.
politics into account, which is what the
And
Palestinians say.
without that, it's meaningless.
In terms of Trump's latest move, I mean, it's going to hurt, isn't it? The economy is suffering. But will it have the sort of reaction that he's looking for?
I'm not sure what reaction he is looking for, to be honest. I mean, it is typical Donald Trump in some ways, because he's imposing these sanctions, but then on the other hand is saying, but I really want to talk to the Iranians, and my door is open, happy to have discussions. And I do wonder at some stage whether the Iranians think, okay, well, let's do this. Because in a sense, they've got nothing to lose by doing that, I don't think.
It's not in their style, but though, is it? Getting involved in talks or even sort of reacting to that sort of pressure.
The Iranians? Well, I mean, I think you had the P5+1 process that did produce an agreement that Donald Trump obviously tore up the second he got in there. But I think there was a deal to be made, and Rouhani was a separate creature to the Ayatollah. Yeah. And the difference or the challenge was how do you split those two groups and put one on your side? And now I think what Trump has done with this latest deal is put them both on one side against the U.S. And if you want to have talks, putting sanctions on the foreign minister so he can't move anywhere, a foreign minister who most people agree is a serious figure that would speak on behalf of the regime and could negotiate a deal, and you're going to cut him out of the picture, isn't what I would put as step one. But we'll see what he gets out of it.
The Iranians suggesting that he's lying about really wanting talks.
There is a lack of consistency in the approach. On the one hand, this belligerence, and then on the other hand, this claim that it's all. I mean, and when he says he wants talks, it's on the basis that goes against the deal that was already negotiated, that everyone else agrees was viable. So it's hard to take that seriously. It sounds good, but his behaviour is not consistent with somebody who wants to. And as we've just been saying, if you want talks, it's hard to see how this facilitates it. This makes it harder to talk. This pushes everybody into a more hardline position against the US, and it's not a practical way of achieving dialogue.
But I do think Trump wants to get to a position where he can go to a summit somewhere and meet with an Iranian somewhere and have lots of television cameras there talking about them meeting and getting to a peace plea. And Donald Trump can then, wax lyrically about the real estate opportunities along the Persian Gulf and why don't the Iranians develop that, which he would probably seriously do. And then if it comes to something great, if not, Donald Trump is still the center of another news cycle, is still the central actor in world politics, and can take that home and sell that as him as the indispensable man.
And we've seen that in North Korea, haven't we? The belligerence so that you can get to a point where you're having talks and then you can claim that you have solved the problem, but even though nothing's actually changed.
It's interesting that there's talk about the Korean talks, restarting. Trump's going to be visiting South Korea. If he's not having much joy with Iran, perhaps the solution is to start looking back at the North Korean situation.
This is where, I don't really agree with that analysis of what's happened in Korea. I think that if it hadn't been for Trump, there wouldn't have been any talks at all. So let's at least give him credit for something. Now, you might say, well, what has emerged from it? Well, the fact is, he's had 2 meetings with Kim Jong-un. That can only be good in the sense that it's much more difficult to press a button to destroy a country if you've actually met the people who are in charge of it. And they clearly seem to get on a personal basis. So you can take some crumbs of comfort from it. What I think the difficult thing here is what's going to happen in 2 days' time when the Iranians announce that they have now exceeded the limits of the uranium enrichment and they've effectively gone against the agreement. That puts the Europeans in a very difficult position because they'll actually have to choose which way to jump, and I'm not sure what the result of that will be.
Trouble ahead. It's always about commodities, says Rahila. And El Mehdi says, make the Middle East great again. He screwed everything up, says Grant, especially in the Middle East. It's so complex, the Middle East, isn't it? Do you think he knows what he's taking on?
The Trump style of these big, brash statements announced on Twitter is hard to see how that is conducive to a situation that is complex and fragile.
Welcome to CNN Talk. The Trump administration busy in the Middle East, various initiatives taking place there. Will they work?
The U.S. president wants a new nuclear agreement with Iran, and he is using economic pressure to try to force a return to the negotiating table,
targeting its supreme leader and Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders.
These measures represent a strong and proportionate response to Iran's increasingly provocative actions.
Actions like last week's downing of a U.S. drone by an Iranian missile.
You cannot start a dialogue with somebody who is threatening you.
A senior Iranian lawmaker putting in even stronger terms saying, Mr. Trump, until sanctions are suspended from Tehran, only military forces will talk to you.
I think a lot of restraint has been shown by us, a lot of restraint, and that doesn't mean we're going to show it in the future.
Meanwhile, Mr. Trump's son-in-law is in Bahrain right now to pitch the White House plan for Palestinian prosperity.
Hopefully we can create a framework in which to move forward economically.
But the Palestinians don't see it that way. They see the economic plan as an attempt to buy off their national aspirations.
And I cannot understand how the Palestinians, before they even heard the plan, rejected outright.
We need the economy and we need the money. Before everything, there is a political solution.
Does Trump have a playbook here, sir? And if so, will it work?
Will Trump's Middle East strategy work? Yes, says Anderson on Facebook. Absolutely, it'll work. Anne says, no, I don't think so. David says, what strategy? He's just stumbling around. Has he got a strategy, Andrew?
Well, I think he's been consistent in one thing, is that he sees the Saudis and the Sunni side of the divide in the Middle East as his partners in whatever he's doing, whether that's economic opportunity for the United States, whether that's putting pressure on Iran and the Shia Muslim community, or putting pressure on their proxies in places like Syria. I think he's been consistent in that. But he's also been consistent in his pursuit of the dollar, which he said in an interview this week. He said he pretty much doesn't care what his allies in the Middle East do as long as they buy lots of stuff from him. And it doesn't matter if they advance peace or push it back. As long as he's all right, I think he's fine with this strategy.
The sanctions that he's put in place is going to do some harm, Afwa, to the Iranian economy already suffering, so targeting Iran's supreme leader, denying him access to financial resources, and 1,000 Iranian people will be targeted as well with the previous sanctions. US is prohibiting the purchase of Iranian oil, steel, aluminium and copper. It's going to have an impact, isn't it?
It is. I mean, the previous sanctions have been devastating for many Iranians and have had a serious impact on the economy. I'm not sure that the new sanctions are going to add that much substantively for the country, but they certainly hit people, key people in the regime, including the ambassadors and foreign affairs spokespeople and people appointed by the council, and that symbolically does have an impact. But the impact that it seems to have to me is one that makes it harder for people to engage in talks, and that's why I'm finding it very difficult to understand how this is actually conducive to moving forward. It does seem like it's meant for show rather than for any constructive solution.
Yeah, because Trump is suggesting talks are an option as long as they don't pursue a nuclear weapon. But do you think he really wants talks?
I think he probably does. If you look at his track record with North Korea, for example, he acted very tough towards Kim Jong-un, and then there were talks, as we discussed earlier. Not sure they achieved an awful lot apart from building a human relationship. I thought the most interesting aspect of your package there was when the Iranians said, well, we'll only be dealing with you in a military way. Now, that's quite chilling, because if they do deliver on that, and we saw the downing of the drone, and we still don't know the exact circumstances of that, but if they pursue that as a strategy, that is an incredibly risky thing to do when you're dealing with a personality like Donald Trump, because his natural reaction, if you attack me, boy, am I going to attack you. Yeah. And so far, actually, in his presidency, he's proved to be less than trigger-happy. But given that kind of rhetoric, I can see that changing.
And there's a lot of moving parts there, too. It's not just U.S. versus Iran directly. There's Iranian involvement in places like Yemen, like Syria. in the Golan Heights, in Gaza Strip. There are Iranian proxies all over the Middle East, so it's not that there's just one chess piece you have to checkmate. You have to get a whole bunch of them. And the ability for the Iranians to work asymmetrically and through proxies makes this a very complicated and difficult discussion. It's not the mighty U.S. military against a weakened Iranian military. It is much more sinister and complicated.
And there has been some surprise at the Iranian capacity to shoot down this drone. I mean, it was a substantial drone, wingspan bigger than a Boeing, and latest US military technology. And I think some people are not to say that the US doesn't have superior military might, obviously, were this to escalate ultimately to an armed conflict, but that it wouldn't necessarily be a breeze to engage in military conflict with Iran, and that rightly would give Trump pause for thought.
Lee on Facebook says, I think it'll work. Iran is struggling. They'll lash out again, though. Heidi says, the poor of Iran will suffer, not the elites. Fred is there in Tehran. What sort of response have you had to these sanctions, Fred?
Hi, Max. Well, it's been a pretty angry response coming from the Iranians. On the one hand, they're echoing some of the things that some of your guests are saying. They're saying, look, on the whole, these sanctions are not going to have a great deal of effect or impact on the Iranian economy as a whole. Of course, it is people from the country's leadership. Now, Hassan Rouhani came out earlier today, Max, and he said in his speech, look, the supreme leader really doesn't own any assets in the United States or abroad, so it's not going to hit him very hard. And then also the other people who were sanctioned, many of them are senior leaders of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Many of them have been sanctioned in the past already, and pretty much all of them are among the most elite forces and the most loyal forces also to the power structure here. So certainly it's not going to change the way that Iran does business both at home and also in the broader region as well. Rouhani then lashed out at the United States and said that the White House suffers what he called mental disability because for putting in place these sanctions. Essentially what the Iranians are saying, though, and I think this also echoes some of what you guys were saying, they're saying, look, on the one hand, you're saying you want Iran to go back to the negotiating table. On the other hand, you've said that you're going to sanction not only the supreme leader, but also the foreign minister, the top diplomat of the country. And the Iranians are saying that just goes against any sort of, or seems to go against any sort of will to engage. And I think what you have, Max, and you continue to have, is a fundamental disconnect between Washington and Tehran, where the Trump administration is saying they're going to sanction Iran until it comes to the negotiating table, whereas the Iranians are saying it's precisely these sanctions that are preventing them from getting to the negotiating table. And the Iranians, once again, I just got this from an elite Iranian commander. He said that any country that engages in adventurism, as he calls it, in this region would not survive. So some pretty tough talk. But just to get back to what some of your guests were saying, the Iranians have for a long time been saying that if there is a confrontation between themselves and the United States, it would be an asymmetrical one. It would not only be between the militaries of the United States and the Iranian military, but it would also involve the proxy forces of Iran as well. And one thing that one senior Revolutionary Guard commander told me, which really rings out until now, he said, look, the Americans need to understand that next to almost every military base that they have in the Middle East, there is a pro-Iranian militia that would get involved in that. And that's just something that they need to take into consideration as well, Max.
OK, Fred, thank you. Lynn on Facebook says Trump goes from hour to hour, changing like the wind, a total shambles. There's no strategy. These are some of the front pages, Afua. I mean, the main Western page is really just talking about how he's turning up the heat. But Iran Daily, interesting headline, Russia vows to counter fresh US sanctions on Iran, saying effectively they're going to step in and help the economy where the US is allowing it to suffer.
I do feel like that's kind of slipped with all the obsession about Trump saying what he's going to do and what he's backed down from doing. The reason that there is a huge weariness towards anything like an escalation in the Middle East is because it embroils everybody. And we know how complicated and messy that would be. And there is so much at stake here. And I have to say I've been quite surprised at some of the praise Trump's been getting, including from some quite counterintuitive quarters, like former head of the CIA, who's very critical of Trump, saying that it's good that he stepped back from his brinkmanship. Because why did he go there in the first place?
Why are you surprised at that?
Why did he go there in the first place? I can't see the value in a strategy where you threaten something and then you withdraw from it publicly. It'd be better not to threaten it in the first place. All that communicates is an air of unpredictability that destabilises everybody.
That can be a real positive in international relations, actually. But we're not used to it. We've gone for decades with this one way of conducting international relations, and Trump has come along and completely ripped that up. Now, we might sort of recoil at that in some ways, and we often do. But it can be an advantage when you don't know what a world leader is going to do, when he or she is unpredictable. It's not all one-way traffic on this. And as for that Iranian headline there in the Iran Daily, Russia going to step in, with what exactly? I mean, the Russian economy is the same size as Italy's. It's not as if it's an economic superpower.
Could give it some oil, I suppose, might be one thing that they could do.
Give Iran oil. Iran needs
oil.
Well,
they can't process. I mean, they could step in, maybe military support, servicing their planes.
We've seen what Russian military assistance can do in Syria. I mean, I don't think you should be dismissive of the involvement of Russia.
That was talking about economic involvement.
Hassan Rouhani said this on your point about the sort of confusion. The Pentagon's confused, CENTCOM is confused, referring probably to the drone attack. The White House is confused as well. Amongst this confusion, they have begun to take illogical moves and lie. It's a worrying sort of situation when we're talking about military movements and people are confused. Do you think he's honestly confused?
Well, especially because he's the moderate voice in all of this and was the great hope a few years ago of getting a resolution and conducting the P5+1. That was his take-home to the Iranian people, saying, look, if you trust me to do business, I can do business on our behalf, ease the pressure on the populace while not giving in to the hardliners. Now, every time Donald Trump puts him in check, that boosters the Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollah and puts them offside the civilian government. So it's not helpful at all. And I do think he's genuinely confused about I thought I had some friends or a process here that could at least start the process, and why Donald Trump had to kind of upset the table and take everything off of it to then only start again asking for negotiations is maybe it's the madman theory of diplomacy, but maybe it's just stupidity.
The lies is a reference, we think, to talks. You know, does he really want talks, or are they lying about that?
Well, there's one way to test that out, isn't there? Call their bluff.
I mean, another scene of confusion is amongst US allies. It's interesting when we're sitting in London, you know, to hear senior British diplomats say this is an example of two things. One, how much Trump has deviated from previous patterns of consulting allies, but also how incapacitated Britain is to even engage at the moment, totally embroiled and consumed with a Tory leadership contest and Brexit. That in the past, this would be something that Britain would have been involved in at a close level. And actually, Trump is just doing his thing, sowing confusion amongst allies, sowing confusion in Iran. I cannot see how this is going to bring us closer to a solution.
Again, you exaggerate the point, because it's not the first time that America has gone it alone on things and ignored Britain. If you remember, in 1983, Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada without telling Margaret Thatcher, and she made her views on that very clear. I think it's also ridiculous to suggest that just because this country is involved in a selection of a new Prime Minister, that the Foreign Office can't cope with any kind of foreign problem that comes along.
Well,
Jeremy Hunt has made quite clear what the British government's view is on this.
I'm reporting what senior diplomats have been saying in the British press about the situation in Iran. So it's not my opinion, it's the opinion of people who are involved in foreign policy and would usually expect to be functioning at a higher level to how they are now, and feel that actually our engagement, not just on Iran, but in the world, has been diminished by the level of which we are consumed.
Yeah, because they're all a bunch of Remainers who want to criticise the government at every point that they can.
Iran's ambassador to the UN says the problem with these talks is that they can't really take place whilst Iran's being threatened. Let's hear from him.
On dialogue with the U.S., I think everybody agrees that dialogue has certain rules and certain regulations. You cannot start a dialogue with somebody who is threatening you, who is intimidating you. Today, we just witnessed that the United States imposed another set of sanctions against Iran. How can we start a dialogue with somebody whose primary preoccupation is to put more sanctions on Iran? So the atmosphere of such a dialogue is not ready yet.
Meryl on Facebook reflecting that, saying chaos is not diplomacy. You've been involved in diplomacy. How would you be handling this?
I'm glad I'm not handling this, but yeah, I mean, you have to at least get one corner that you can defend and work out from if you're trying to move forward in this. If you're the Iranians, I think the one thing that really will be the determining factor is, are the people still on side with you? Is the pressure that they're facing, where does that anger get directed to? Does it get directed to the government because they don't have basics that they need? Is it directed because they can't travel, because the planes can't get maintenance to fly around anymore? Where's the pressure point? And can the government keep them on side long enough to keep threatening the external enemy? So if I were the Iranians, I'd be making sure that my own side's squared away before I start acting like this. I don't think they're doing many consultations, but they can't be offside their own people.
And,
so I think that's
and the Iranians are rapidly getting to a point where they have not got the moral high ground here. A few weeks ago, when America withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, the Iranians did have the moral high ground because all the Europeans said, well, they haven't breached it, so we don't really know what the Americans are talking about. However, on Friday, that's the date when they are going to breach it, according to their own figures.
Yeah.
That's when they lose the moral high ground, and that is when they lose the support of European countries, I imagine.
It's a difficult one for the Europeans to juggle that, isn't it? Because they don't want to fall out with Trump.
Yeah, we don't know which direction European countries are going to go in, but I agree with Ian's analysis. I mean, that is a new... we agree on
we
something.
got there in the end.
Is the new area of uncertainty. And I think... But again, you know, I mean, if we're to give Trump any strategic credit, I suppose this was potentially by design, that by withdrawing from the agreement, you do push Iran to a situation where they are no longer able to be in a comfortable position. And what do? You know, they either suffer more or they start breaching the agreement, which everybody else agreed they wouldn't have breached had Trump not withdrawn from it. So he's created this. And to his credit, I don't agree with his plan. But if his plan is to further alienate Iran, then that is working.
Tim on Facebook says, how can any deal work without allies? And Nweke says, Iran can't accomplish much if they're crippled financially, which is potentially what could come out of these sanctions. Let us know what you think about Trump's Middle East moves. Will they work? We'll be talking about the Palestinian deal as well after the break. Yeah, it's not quite a deal.
To Ian's point, I think it's not just the nuclear deal. I mean, the nuclear deal did not cover things like the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and their adventurism in places like Syria or Yemen. And you know, I used to work for Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who was opposed to the Iranian deal because it didn't deal with Iran's bad behavior elsewhere. And it's fine to put them into a process on the nuclear agreement, which is worthwhile and worth doing. But if they don't stop the rest of their bad behavior in the region, it might not solve the problem that you're trying to solve in the long run, which is broader stability in the Middle East.
Better?
Much.
Finally.
Trump needs to learn the Palestinians are not safe. That from James. We're going to be talking a bit about the...
They're not safe from what?
They're not, well, I think that's the... Trump needs to... The Palestinians aren't for sale.
Oh, aren't for sale?
Yeah, I did actually... I'm glad you corrected me on that.
Yeah.
I'll follow that up.
You could have caused a dispute.
I mean, yeah, the point about that being that they're offering an economic plan which doesn't involve politics.
No, and when we discussed this a couple of months ago, I remember the first thing I said was, well, this seems to be really odd. I mean, nobody's going to object to a really good economic plan that helps Palestinians. But how is it going to help Palestinians when there isn't any kind of political settlement and we don't see any sign of a political settlement being proposed by Trump? Now, it isn't really...
We're talking about Trump's Middle East moves. Will they work? This is what the word cloud says, made up of your comments on our Facebook feed. A big no, basically. It's not just about Iran. It's also about Jared Kushner's policy that he's leading in the Middle East. He's presenting it today in Bahrain. It's an economic plan. Let's hear what he had to say when he was there.
The plan would invest about $50 billion in the region. It would create 1 million jobs in the West Bank and Gaza. It would take their unemployment rate from about 30% to single digits. It would reduce their poverty rate by half if it's implemented correctly. It's a 10-year plan. It would double their GDP. We've had it peer-reviewed now by about a dozen economists in a dozen countries, and we're very excited to put it forward.
All good.
This plan does not address the root causes of the problems in the Palestinian territory. The root causes are the political situation. The reason there is no infrastructure, there is no investment, is because there is no control of the borders, because of sanctions, because there can't be any long-term planning. So I can't see how putting more money in is going to solve the problem when you haven't dealt with the root causes of the underdevelopment and poverty that Palestinians are facing. So to me, it looks very much like a superficial, and not to understate how much the Palestinians need that kind of injection. But to do it without dealing with the political situation, it's clearly a short-term strategy and a sticking plaster.
There's a bit of inconsistency there. You say they need the money, and then you say that you don't really want them to have it because there isn't a political solution.
They need the money once there is a political solution in place.
Well, they need the money now, actually. If you look at the situation in the two areas, they need the money now, regardless of the political situation. How do you know it won't work?
Because how can it work when the root cause of the problem is a political situation that nobody has proposed a solution for?
Well, I agree that the political situation needs to be solved, but just to say that, oh, they shouldn't have any money or investment because that hasn't been done, I think if you were sitting in one of these Palestinian refugee camps, you might disagree with that.
Is it a route to a political solution?
Well, I think it's an unorthodox one if it is a route. As Afua says, you usually put the cart before the horse, you know, or so this putting the cart before the horse, and that you have to have some sort of bedrock to put investment into, that it turns into something not only that helps once, but helps over the long term and sustainable. And I think, look, I mean, this problem is old as time. It feels like we've been talking about this for 50, 60 years. I mean, until Israel accepts that there is to be a nation for the Palestinian people, until the Palestinian people accept that they can't push all the Jews into the sea and have constant conflict between the two nations, there won't be an agreement. And Israel, over its history, say what you will about the country, has made peace deals with Jordan and Egypt and has stuck to them. And I think the hand is out there, maybe not under this current administration, but to make a deal that will last, that you could then take some kind of investment and make people's lives better. But it has to start with politics.
If America is to be the honest broker in the Middle East, which is the role that it has played since the 1970s, up until fairly recently, all parties have got to see it as an honest broker. And at the moment, apart from Israel, nobody does. Because Netanyahu is Trump's main ally in the whole world, it seems. And therefore, the Arab side just will not trust Donald Trump because they think he's in the Israelis' pocket.
I don't know. Mohammed bin Salman trusts Donald Trump a lot because they seem to get on quite well. And Donald Trump's willing to the point to even say, I don't have a problem with you putting a journalist in a vat of acid and dissolving his body. That's not a big deal.
But the Saudis are seen as in cahoots with the Israelis as well, aren't
they? Yeah, but the Saudis have never been interested in helping the Palestinian people. They haven't put any effort, money, time into helping a political settlement there. They've used the Palestinian people, as of many Arab nations, as a stick with which to beat Israel, not to solve the problem, but to prove a point. And this is a dynamic that won't go away no matter how much money Jared Kushner throws at people in Bahrain. It's not a question of money. There has to be a political settlement and an understanding that this will not get solved until people are sitting at the table. But yeah, if I'm a boss, I don't trust the other side. If I'm the Israelis, I don't trust Abbas, because what has he done for 20 years? And if I'm the Saudis or the Canadians or the Americans, I don't think there is an honest
Let's just hear from the Palestinian Authority Prime Minister, who was speaking to Christian.
The figures are so exaggerated to the extent that we don't believe it. First. Secondly, this economic workshop is totally divorced from any political dimension. So the issue is really not an economic issue. The Palestinians are hoping for independence, sovereign state, end of occupation. The issue for us is not about economic issues.
You do wonder how this Kushner plan can possibly work when the Palestinians are dismissing it outright.
And they're not the only ones. I mean, about 80% of the business and political and civil society leaders who have been invited to participate in this conference have decided not to. So all the signs are that it's not being seen as a credible plan.
Why are they doing it
in the region? Why is Kushner doing it?
Yeah.
Well, it sounds great, doesn't it? Like Ian was saying, we know that there's chronic need Palestinians for investment, and this, on a very simplistic level, is money, they need infrastructure, they need development. But the problem is that I don't see how it could have any sustainable future without addressing the underlying causes. And I think other people in the region see that. And Kushner just wants to be able to say something that sounds good so he can say that he's offering a solution.
Speaking to some of the things Ian was talking about, poverty, it was half the poverty in the Palestinian territories, unemployment to single digits, and it's projects for all Palestinians. And when they're struggling to survive, there is some level of appeal at ground level, surely.
Well, there's a short-term appeal to a lot of that, it has to be said, because in the short term, if you pump in billions of dollars to any area, I mean, it is going to be helpful. But in the long term, the only way that the Palestinian territories are going to become properly independent politically and economically is for a normal economy to be introduced, for entrepreneurs to be able to feel that if they start a business, it will work. You can't just pour money. I mean, it's a very socialist thing that Jared Kushner is actually proposing here, isn't it? Pump money in and the state will make it all better. That's not capitalism, is it? And that's what he would normally have promoted.
Aurora on Facebook says Palestinians need financial help. Afua is wrong.
I'm not denying that they need financial help. I just would like the financial help to be meaningful in the long term to actually changing the economic reality. As Ian was saying, I don't think that is realistic without addressing the political solution. And, you know, back to our earlier point about needing an honest broker, this is why it matters how America positions itself on Israeli policy. This is why it matters to just announce that it recognises Jerusalem as the capital, because they've lost all credibility in the region as an honest broker, and that means that there is a vacuum in which the real meaningful political negotiation can move forward. And without that, this will not solve the problem.
There will never be an agreement in the Middle East, says Lee.
It's hard not to be. I don't want to be cynical, but we have 60, 70 years of history that shows that that's true. And I don't know what the unblocking mechanism for this. I don't know how an honest broker emerges. And I think the Palestinians have shown one thing, is that they're willing to forego economic opportunity in pursuit of a principle that they want their own land free of Israeli settlements. And they're willing to trade a lot for that, whether they've been ill-served by their leadership or not. I think they've shown the world over and over again that it's not just a question of handing them some money. You know, UN aid agencies have been in there for forever, and Canada and other countries have been giving tens of millions of dollars a year to support the Palestinians. That hasn't been the issue. The issue must be two countries, what are the borders, do we agree, stop attacking each other, and then, as Ian says, put in the mechanics to get a properly functioning economy with political representation.
Jeff says at least this administration is working and trying over there. He's obviously speaking from the US. That's more than I can say for past administrations. But Stephen says Trump's sole purpose has always been to undo everything Obama achieved. You can have your say. The debate continues on our Facebook feed. Thank you for watching.